Hi, my name is Ana Saiz. I'm General Director of Sin Fronteras. I'm very happy that you could join us today. Hate incidents are taking place every day. People being bullied for speaking Spanish or for looking Latino. These incidents include the man who threatened to report the workers of a fast food restaurant in New York to ICE because they were speaking in Spanish and assumed they were undocumented immigrants, or the dangerous case of the Mexican who was pushed into the subway tracks by an African American who had already been charged with a hate crime. Whilst in Mexico, the assassination of Victoria Salazar, a Salvadorian migrant who was murdered by Mexican police, or the 64% of Central American migrant detainees in Mexico who indicated having received mistreatment by the officers, discrimination is an act that limits or hinders the access to rights of those affected. Migration is a process that demands long-term challenges to avoid acts of racial violence. This escalation of hatred and discrimination is not happening out of nowhere. It's a reality that must be addressed in order to tackle and confront it. I invite you to join us today, where we will be discussing the issue of discrimination towards migrants in Mexico and the United States. So I am very happy to be sharing this space with Alexandra Haas, Executive Director of Oxfam Mexico. Alexandra, hello. Maria Meier, Director of We Are the People. And Mónica Bauer, Latinos Affairs Coordinators and the Anti-Defamation League. So, first of all, how would you define discrimination, please? Go on, Ale. Yes.
Okay. Hi, Anna. I'm so glad to be here. Thank you for sharing the table with me. I'm sorry I couldn't join you in person. I wish I could. So discrimination is at least in the Mexican legal context, the unfair treatment or distinctions that are made in the way that people are treated. And when we speak of unfair treatment, we speak of treatment or differences that are made that are unreasonable, that are not objective, and that have as the consequence of which is becoming an obstacle in people exercising their human rights. And we have a list of categories that are the classic categories of discriminated groups. Discrimination can happen because of your gender, your national origin, your ethnic origin, your sexual orientation, your gender identity, your age, your health situation, or your political ideas or religion. And in the context of Mexico, discrimination has been a concept that is quite new to sort of the social conversation, although it has taken sort of a center stage in the last few years when we have been reflecting collectively on how racism, machismo, clasismo in Mexico have sort of been unveiled. It's taken us a long time to get to this point, but finally we are able to come to terms with the fact that we are a racist, a machista society, and that we definitely must take strong steps to fight against that.
Thank you very much, Alexandra. I think you illustrated very well and explained deeply how it works in the Mexican legal framework and in general in the culture of Mexico. So I would like to go back to Maria or Monica, if you can explain the difference with this category of discrimination in the United States. Please, who wants to start?
I mean, I'm okay to start if it's okay.
Yes, because perfect.
The cases that you described at the beginning of the conversation are what we call hate incidents, hate crimes, and acts of discrimination. So we at ADL, that's what we do every single day. We're fighting this kind of hate that comes to us either through media or through, we have an incident response form online, which is available in English and in Spanish. But what's the way that the law works in the United States is we have a category for hate crimes. And hate crimes are criminal acts that are motivated by bias, prejudice, or bigotry. And the difference between a hate crime and a hate incident is that with a hate crime, we need to have a crime. And everything else is a hate incident. So, for example, when those people are shouted, go back to Mexico or build a wall, that's considered a hate incident because there's no crime. But the examples that you said about a person being thrown into the tracks, that's a hate crime. So that's a very important distinction under the US law. And so that's basically, the difference. There's a very good resource in our website called The Pyramid of Hate, which explains how hate can escalate. So basically, discriminatory jokes or little, sometimes even comments that start just like in the bottom of the pyramid can start escalating into discrimination, hate incidents, and hate crimes. And the top of the pyramid is genocide, which is the destruction of, the complete, the purposeful destruction of a whole nation or a whole group of people. So I highly recommend that resource that really explains how hate can escalate.
Okay, thank you very much, Monica. That was really, really clear. But I want to ask Maria. Maria, framing this discrimination or hate, even hate crimes, against migrants or refugees, can you describe a bit what you work on and what have you analyzed with this kind of acts, please?
Yes, thank you. And I'd like to begin by giving, if I might, my definition of discrimination that came to me when I was thinking about this question. And Alejandra and Monica gave very, very good definitions of it in a legal sense. I'm approaching it in a slightly moral sense. And for me, discrimination is an intentional act taken by somebody who has power, or at least believes they have power, to limit the power of somebody else. Now, that power doesn't have to mean something so big as the power of the President of the United States. It can be, as you cited, example of someone yelling at those they heard speaking Spanish in the store. That person perceived they had power to define what it means to be an American, that to be in this country, you have to speak English and you are the other. And it is my right to tell you what to do, to limit your actions, to limit your ability to express and speak with one another. Unfortunately, we know that hate incidences, as Monica explained, are all too common. And one of the reasons that they're common is because people, or that we've seen an increase in the past couple of years, is people felt empowered to be able to express their hate. And that came from the leadership that we had at the top. I work to help get more representation, more diversity in people who can influence our national discourse. And by having those faces that look like us, we can shape that discussion. And I think shape the tone in which people feel they can react or not react, and what is considered acceptable expression of that hate, which is hopefully not acceptable at all.
I find that very interesting, and I want to link it to what just Monica said about this escalate, how it escalates the violence. It seems unimportant or simple, but it really does have a strong impact on the life or on the rights of people being discriminated. So I would like to know a bit, how do you work to tackle this discrimination from your own organization or whatever initiatives you have? So I would like that to hear from Alexandra now, from more. I know Oxfam has a regional work, but from the Mexican perspective, how do you tackle these incidents?
Thank you, Anna. I just wanted to say that I have used many times the pyramid that Monica referred to. That's an ADL resource that I value a lot because it explains something that sometimes it's hard from a policy perspective to put forward. And it's that even acts that are not legally an act of discrimination, that don't fit the legal definition, need to be observed and need to be monitored because they can become sort of a space that allows for worse acts until you get to hate crimes, right? And so I find it very useful to illustrate how in respect to certain groups in the population, there's sort of a permissiveness, sort of a tolerance for making jokes and saying things and generalizing certain ideas, and we feel that there's nothing hurtful comes from saying what you feel or what you think, but actually what you are doing is sort of building a space that then makes people feel like they can be comfortable discriminating someone, and that's very dangerous. With regard to migrants and the work that we do at Oxfam, we are very worried that in the last few years, particularly with the caravans coming from Central America, we've seen more and more discriminatory and xenophobic comments, for example, in social networks, or even in people on the media. It's not the whole country. I feel like Mexico is a very mixed place where you have a lot of solidarity as well. I could see it myself in Tapachula when I was there when the caravan arrived, and there were people coming out of their homes to give migrants water and food and clothes. I mean, that cannot be sort of overseen. But we also could see, for example, media coverage of the caravan that was extremely discriminatory and totally misunderstanding or sort of questioning the motivations of migrants. And, I think we should be more sensitive in Mexico. And that's something that has surprised, I think, me and other people in academia and in civil society. We as Mexicans thought we would be more sensitive towards migrants, right? Because there are so many of us in the United States. But the problem is that racism and xenophobia are a global problem. And even countries like Mexico that have a large community outside of our countries, we're not vaccinated against that virus of xenophobia and racism. So what we're doing in Oxfam is we're building a program on migration that will focus on building networks between organizations, but also with private sector and with local and the federal government, to come up with ideas of how we can tackle some specific problems. I think there are low-hanging fruit types of problems, like, for example, making it easier for people to be in Mexico and looking at sort of bureaucratic obstacles to achieve rights that are, I feel, the easiest part. And then there are more complicated issues like a cultural change or, cultural influence, and making sure that the narratives, right narratives, are on the table. One last word on that is that we value very much the fact that in the US, you can hear the voices of migrants, even undocumented migrants or people in process of obtaining legal status, have a safe space to speak for themselves. And I feel Mexico doesn't really have that safe space for migrants themselves. And that is something that we would like to work on with communities, to be able to listen to migration experiences from the person that has lived it and that can tell us much more about their experiences as a migrant in Mexico, which sometimes is it can be very trying to speak about trauma or the ways in which you've been discriminated, but people need to hear this. We need, as a society, to listen to migrants' voices. So that's some of the things that we're doing right now, Anna.
Okay, thank you very much, Alex. I would like to ask Maria, how are you working on this? And I am going to ask you to focus on this discourse, social media, what you were mentioning just before, because you just finished this Trump administration that I think it was very, very harmful for hate speech. So I would like to listen a bit about what you're doing on that.
Yes, thank you. And building off of what Alejandra said, the stories do need to be told, and there is great power in storytelling. And on both sides of the border, we need to, those of us who have access to outlets for these stories, need to support ways to allow migrants to tell their stories. We have seen studies in this country that if you ask people generally, they may be concerned about immigration, but when you put it in the context of, yeah, but your neighbor, it's like, oh, yes, I like that person. I know they're hardworking. I know they just want to build a better life for themselves and their family. When you have that human face, they are more welcoming and accepting. So while there has been a lot of problem with social media, and it can be a very dangerous place for promoting intolerance and hate, it can also be a really, really powerful outlet for migrants themselves to tell their own stories. And I do think in this country, we are doing a better job. Again, it really was a new day in January when we changed our administration, because we were dealing with really fear and hate-driven policies for 4 years. And overnight, we stepped into an era not of just tolerance, but of embracing our diversity and acceptance that includes immigration, includes migrants, and it includes helping them tell their story. And it's also, we've seen a rollback of some of that hate-driven policy, but we've also seen in this very short time, and some of it is very much driven by the people who use it, there's been an accountability asked of people who are in charge of social media to police it themselves so that it doesn't become just a haven for hate speech. And I think all of us who use it do have to demand of the companies that guard that cannot be allowed to continue. But there's some wonderful outlets. And again, in working to support, not speaking on their behalf, but providing the structure so that immigrants, migrants can tell their own story, I think that's the most powerful way, again, to change attitudes.
Thank you very much, Mariah. But what do you think, Monica? Do you think there is such thing as a safe space, as Alexandra was talking? Because in Mexico, it's really harsh. Even the legal framework doesn't allow people to speak. I mean, freedom of expression is really limited for not nationals, let's say. So what do you feel about this safe space, and how do you work to change that in the United States?
I have so many thoughts of what Alejandra and Maria said. Let me just start by echoing Maria that there's been a huge change in the administration. Just the narrative against, regarding immigrants and refugees has changed dramatically. But I think for 5 years, basically since it's been 5 years of constantly every single day hearing really these horrible things about immigrants and refugees on the media, on the social, not only the mainstream media, but also social media. And this amount of hate speech, just because there's a change in administration, is not necessarily going away. So we are still following a lot of these anti-immigrant narratives that we hear from many, many, many different places. So that's one thing. The other thing is that Maria, I felt, was very positive about the social media. We at ADL are following very closely the algorithms. Actually, we have a Center on Technology and Society that follows this very, very, does a lot of reports, and it brings a lot of information to policymakers, because the amount of hate that is being pushed on social media is something horrible. Actually, we were one of the 9 organizations that organized the campaign Stop Hate for Profit, that pressured Facebook to sit down with civil rights organizations to talk about hate. And this is an issue not only in the US, because Facebook is a global organization and it's affecting every single immigrant all around the globe. Whatever they do, whatever policy they have, it affects everyone. So we really took the lead with these other 9 civil rights organizations in sitting down with Facebook and with Congress and really talking about these issues. Actually, we just put forth a plan called Repair Plan to offer a comprehensive framework for platforms and policymakers to take meaningful action to decrease online hate and extremism. Because we saw what happened on January 6th at the US Capitol was organized on social media. So we are very concerned. There is actually a whole campaign just focused on misinformation in Spanish called the Ya Basta campaign. We're also part of that. So there's a lot of work that we need to do on social media. That's one of the pieces. Regarding safe spaces, although there is the framework, the legal framework for people to report, for example, hate crimes in the US. A lot of immigrants don't feel safe to go and report these kinds of crimes, or not only even hate crimes, just any crime. Like they are very afraid of having, ICE, immigration authorities be involved and then having their family at risk. So even though in many communities, there's this open space for people to come and report crimes and acts of discrimination, a lot of the community doesn't feel safe. And so we have to change that. We need to provide the spaces for the community to come forward. One of the things that we do at ADL is to bring together community organizations and law enforcement so they can get to know each other and provide, these spaces where the community can report. Another things that we've been doing now for several years is we have this partnership with the Mexican consulates here in the US. There's 50 Mexican consulates here. And we train consular staff on issues of hate crimes and hate incidents. And we have a whole campaign called Denuncia el Odio. So people can go to the consulate and report crimes in the consulate in Spanish, and they can feel safer there. So we are trying to provide those safe spaces for people to report.
I am very glad to listen how you're working also in campaigns in Spanish. I guess that must be very, very important to make this reassurance in people that they can speak their voice out. So I would like to know, how optimistic are you three on the future? How do you from the Mexican perspective, from the American perspective, but I would like to listen something about the future. What can you foresee? I mean, I know it's difficult, but I am sure the audience want to know a bit about it. So Alexandra, please.
So I think we have no choice but to be optimistic, right? Otherwise, we wouldn't work in these topics. But I think optimism is more of a feeling than a strategy, and I think the strategy has to be in place, and we have to work towards where we are. I feel that one of the things that makes me optimistic is dialogue between the Mexican and the U.S. government. That is a huge space for opportunity to bring more sort of elements to the discussion and to policy decisions, and I think that's part of the sort of agenda that we need to look at, and also with Central American governments. I mean, this is a regional issue. Migration is a regional issue. We've discussed how very openly and for many years how migration shouldn't be seen as a situation that affects one single country. We need to look at regional movements of people. We need to look at the root causes, of course, and that's always something that is on the table. I feel like there's so much that we can do for ourselves in Mexico, because also migration from Mexico is growing again, and in other countries, to help sort of solve those structural problems that are sometimes a part of the reasons why people need to leave their homes. But the other thing is we can't only specifically look at the root causes. We need to look at where people are now, what their lives are like. If people have decided to live their lives in Mexico or in the US or in Central America, they need to have their human rights respected, whoever they are, wherever they come from. And I just want to take back to a phrase that I don't know if Monica or Maria said, I can't remember, but one of them said, people just want, I think Maria, want a decent life with the possibility of having work and having their kids in school and having healthcare. And I feel like we forget that many times. And if we can bring that to the table over and over again, and we can make sure that society's decision makers remember that that is the main point of migration, is being able to have a life somewhere where your kids can be safe and they can go to school. If we remember that, and we remember that basically we're all human beings, maybe we can work out a more long-term solution. The other thing I think, Anna, is the fact that I think also more and more people are sort of coming up with ideas for integration. I think a great movement, cultural movement from sort of the 20th century to the 21st century is that we went from assimilation in general as a rule, as the way in which people could be a part of society, to integration, which is a much more respectful and understanding way of looking at things that sort of protects cultural diversity, but also sets the stage for equal rights for everybody. And I feel that, although sometimes we're very focused on the short term and we're looking at elections and government changes and policy changes and people that are in Congress, we should also look at that sort of how that framework has matured over the years and how much all of these organizations like ADL and others have contributed to that change of perspective. And that also makes me hopeful, because I feel that we have managed to move from a model that wasn't really open to diversity to a more open and understanding and a better way of looking at these things, even though there's still a long way to go to achieve what we've set ourselves to. But sort of the goal looks much better now.
Okay. Thank you very much, Alexandra. I want to see if Maria or Monica are so optimistic about it. And I like that Alejandra spoke about short-term and long-term, and also this regional perspective, which I think it's really, really a key issue on our migration movement. So please, Maria.
Yes, thank you. And I appreciate everything Alejandra said. I do think the key to this approach, it has to be in two directions. It has to be the very here and now, the people who are at the border, who are crossing, the children, the people who are experiencing violence daily and do just want to make a better life. But we also can't keep looking at this as a short-term issue, and it is going to take structural change. One of the Monica called me an optimist with regards to social media, and I do acknowledge, I want to say this, that there are many, many problems, and we do still have to be on guard. But I guess the change I'm seeing is at least more of a demand of accountability for those who can control content. The strategy absolutely does have to be longer term, and we have to recognize that we have full partners. It's not just the US dictating policy, that it has to be a combined effort. And this is a bit of a change from how we've approached it in the past. Overall, when I was thinking about this question, what came to mind was a story that I grew up hearing from my grandmother. And both my grandparents on my Mexican side came when they were very young. They made their way from California and Texas to Missouri, Kansas, and Iowa. And it was in Iowa, in particular, in one small town they lived at. My grandfather worked on the railroad. It's a very traditional Mexican immigrant story for that generation. At night, men would come and throw rocks at the house. because they didn't like Mexicans living in their town. And they would turn out the lights and they would endure because they needed the work. And it was only one night when they had the window open that a rock came through, and my grandmother said nearly hit her mother in the head. And they decided, well, if we're not wanted, we're just going to move. No, there wasn't an ADL then, there weren't hate crimes or hate laws, and there was no recourse except to get out of the way. I realized that was almost 100 years ago. And sometimes I think, when I look back at the stories of the shooting in El Paso that so directly targeted Mexicans and Mexican Americans who have been in that region for hundreds of years, I think we haven't made progress. But then I also think of the opportunities I've had, and my grandmother never imagined that her granddaughter would be walking in the halls of Congress. So there are changes, but it is incumbent that we change not just the individual people, but the structure. So in my work, again, I'm working very hard to make sure the faces who are sitting at the table with their counterparts developing this legislation look like the people who are being impacted. We have to create allyships. Even if immigrant communities cannot vote, we still have to work together to defend the right of those of us who can, and who right now are being targeted to keep away from the ballot box because they know our vote, our Latino vote, makes a difference. So from that standpoint, when I go back and say, yes, we have made change, I am optimistic. But again, it is continual long-term strategy that involves forming partnerships, even with communities outside our own, because they recognize that these issues, we're a global society now, they're not just impacting our community or the border region or Mexico or the Mexican Americans here, but that we have real impact on the direction of our nations. And that in turn affects all of us at a much larger scale.
Thank you, Maria. It's very interesting to see how it's the structure that needs to be changed. And you spoke about political rights. And I think those are very, very important for structural changes. So I want to listen a bit. Monica, what do you foresee for the future?
Well, let me start in a little bit of a negative note, just because Maria mentioned the attack in El Paso. And I think it's really important to understand that this happened just recently. This happened in 2019. It was the deadliest attack on the Latino community in US history. And 1 year prior to that, we had the worst attack on the Jewish American community in history. So we've seen a rise of extremists and white supremacists that it's like so scary for the whole of society. And this is something that we need to address head on, because ADL, we have a center on extremism that tracks, this hateful rhetoric and groups. But we have seen this move from the extremes to the mainstream. Like, just to give you an example, there's something called the Great Replacement theory that talks about how immigrants are replacing the true Americans. Or in Europe, they talk about the replacement of the true Europeans, because of the immigrants that are coming from Africa or from the Middle East. So this Great Replacement theory has really affected and inspired extremists to do attacks. So we saw the attack in New Zealand was inspired by that on the mosques. The attack in the synagogue in Pittsburgh, the attack in El Paso. So this is really dangerous, very, very, very dangerous. So that's one of our biggest concerns, because we know in America we have freedom of speech and we've always had extremists, but they were in the extremes. And we want to keep them in the extremes, not in the mainstream. And today we see people in the news talking about replacement, like if it's not a white supremacist theory. So that's very scary. Now, from the positive, optimistic side, I agree with Alexandra in the sense of integration of immigrants. And I'm optimistic in the sense that the US was really built on immigrants. Like when people really see the history of the US, and besides Native Americans and slaves that were brought against their will, everybody else is an immigrant or has an immigrant story. So I'm very optimistic in the sense that the US has an amazing way of integrating immigrants. And I see it with my children. My children were born in Mexico, and I brought them here. And immediately they go to school, they learn the language, they learn their culture. And I work where I live, it's one of the counties where most refugees are resettled. And I see how quickly the system works to resettle these refugees. So in that sense, I'm optimistic that there's a history of integrating successfully, let's say integration, but successful integration of immigrants in the US. And I'm hoping that this history will be positive enough to move us forward.
That was great to hear, Monica, because it needs to be a system that works. So this can be possible, and people can have this access to the rights, so they can lead a happy life or a fulfilled life. So I guess this was fascinating. You three gave us a lot to think about, and it was really, really fantastic sharing this time with you. I hope the audience enjoyed it as much as I did, and it really was a pleasure talking to you. And congratulations for everything you're doing from each organization. Thank you very, very much.